we haven't had full information that the research hasn't been done. Now, in the separate Gene Technology Council, where we mainly have agricultural ministers, we find that the ministers in the eastern states are prepared to look at lifting their moratorium in the eastern states on production of GM food after March next year. Now, Western Australia has a commitment that for the whole term of the Carpenter government, we will not lift the moratorium on GM food. Now, within the moratorium, it provides the ability for testing. So trial crops on cotton have been done in the Kimberley, and one canola trial crop was done, but the major food production company, multinational in Australia, pulled out of their funding. So I'd argue that we're still 10 years away from having full, proper health analysis of a food crop in Western Australia for GM.
We've just seen the horse flu and the threat to the racing industry and horse industry in Australia, and everyone's aware of the threat of cane toads and other pests that have spread around Australia. Do you see a similar threat from GMO, and if so, how do you think it should be stopped?
Look, I think that's a very, very important issue, and it's the cross-contamination that is the big fear from organic producers and from many, many farmers in WA. WA is in a unique situation of having a reputation for producing clean and green food, be it lobsters that are freighted overnight to Japan, or be it our wheat, our barley and our other crops. Now, because of the Nullarbor Desert, because of the tyranny of distance, we're actually in the unique situation that if the eastern states do want to go down the path of GM, we're not going to get pollination from a nearby crop. However, the moment we do allow full-scale production of GM crops, say in the wheat belt here or in the Kimberley, then that means that nearby growers who choose to have organic crops or GM-free crops, that they do risk cross-pollination. And the Insurance Council in Australia has been reluctant to provide insurance because they know that a number of countries around the world will not accept exports the moment there is some GM contamination in food. So if you're producing organic wheat in Beverley or York, and suddenly in the testing you've got 5% GM grain is found in a test, then that means your niche market in South Korea, for example, elsewhere in Asia who have banned GM imports, then you've lost that, and clearly you'd have grounds to sue a farmer who's allowed his GM grain to cross-pollinate into yours.
John, it's encouraging to see the commitment of the present government in Western Australia in relation to GMO. Do you think that commitment is going to stay with us for a long time, and do you think it will be effective in the long run?
I think we need to really get a gauging of community support. I guess my one hesitation is that I'm not hearing the support for our GM-free status and our moratorium from the community as loudly as I thought it would. Now, it may be that people are just assuming that we're going to stay GM-free, or that people aren't thinking about it, but to me this is as important an issue as stopping old growth logging in our forests. Certainly our government's commitment is for this full term, but clearly going into the next election cycle by the end of next year, then all the people who formulate government policy will be looking very strongly at the community feedback and the input. Now, clearly we've got the Liberal Party and the Nationals are saying they support removing the GM moratorium and allowing GM production. We've got some very loud economic interests who want it gone. The federal government wants it gone. Eastern states, I think I can read the wind, and we'll have a number of states over there will remove their moratorium early next year. I still believe that the West Australian community will want us to keep the GM ban. I've got nothing against GM itself. Many of our medicines, our best medicines, are of course genetically modified, but they've been proven safe after 15-18 years of intensive research, and probably only 2% of the GM medicines that start out in a testing actually end up being proved safe and healthy for human consumption. So if somebody can undertake that properly in a WA context and prove after 10 years of research be it in the laboratory, then with animals, and then at a stage with human testing, and then it passes everything with flying colours. Look, I'd be prepared to look at it then, but we're a decade at least away from having that valid research to make an informed decision to allow such a change. You know, in this state, we allowed asbestos, we allowed thalidomide as a medicine. There have been some very bad decisions made from a narrow knowledge base. I think we've got the ability now to wait to get it right, and I think that's the benefit of a moratorium.
John, one of the great things about having farming connections is sitting round the kitchen table eating homemade scones and the like. When the conversation turns to GMO, what do you advise your family in farming, and what do they say back to you?
Well, I think one of the really interesting things is having relatives in farming is they remind you, because we've got a lot of salinity there, and in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, it was governments that were telling farmers that they had to clear all the bush and plant crops or they'd lose it. And it was the farmers that were saying, we actually need to preserve the bush, we need the barriers, we need an ecosystem before the word was invented. And I'm listening to my relatives and others. They're facing this year that we've finally got some rain, record crops. Without GM, WA is the biggest producer of food grains in the world. We actually don't need, on an economic basis, GM. The trials that have been done in canola are only marginally more productive, and in some cases less productive and less financially viable when compared to some naturally grown crops. So I'm very much not leading in this, but listening, and I think the good producers of food in this state, the family farmers, know that they don't want to go down the GM path unless it's rock solid 100% safe.
John, thanks very much for your time. I know you're busy. We haven't heard the bell ring yet, but I'm sure it won't be long.
Yes, Parliament gets in the way of good policy sometimes, but it's very, very necessary, especially when we're looking at changes. Thanks again.
Thanks for your time. In summary, I'd say there is a risk if GMO were to be allowed to be introduced into Western Australia and Australia at the moment. It's encouraging that we have the moratorium in place in our Parliament, and that should allow proper scientific investigation and full community consultation across the whole spectrum of our community. Producers, consumers of food, health professionals, the whole community. This is an incredibly important issue. That's it for today from Perth CTV Talks. We'll see you again, same time, same station next week. Thank you.